So I thought of giving a brief overview of what we're looking at in sort of 3 segments. One of them is to clear the ground a little bit of creativity and flow, because in my experience it is one of those fields where people, even of the highest intellectual standings, have ideas and speculate in a way that you could possibly call not being prudent. Creativity is something that a lot of people have very strong opinions about, of what it is, what it isn't, what it takes to enhance it, what it is associated with, and almost all of these sort of intuitions are mistaken, they're myths, and I get to some of them. Then introduce you a little bit to the problems we have of studying creativity and the misbegotten explanations that have been floating about how creativity happens in the brain. What is different about somebody's brain who's creative on a state of flow as opposed to normal thinking, or whatever that is, actually. We cannot define that either. And since I'm a bit more negative and David will be a bit more positive about what we can and cannot do today, I'm going to end this also on a positive note of ways to get out of this with explanations that are sound. So let me start with one, getting a sense of how important this topic is and to understand how creativity happens in the brain. Imagine an alien species would land on this planet to figure out whether, I guess, planet Earth is worth saving, yeah? Or just let it go down. And the first thing they are trying to do is to figure out what is the quintessence of our humanity. Assuming that they don't have some sort of consciousness detector that they can hold up to our heads and see a light inside, and what would they qualify as what defines the human condition? Taking a quick look around, they'd be hard-pressed not to take our creative, ingenious ways of changing our environment. There isn't an element of the periodic table that we haven't messed with to change the way we live and our surroundings. We're an intensely creative species. And as much as neuroscience has made progress, especially in the last 20 years or so, you'll see that studying creativity is extremely difficult. But everybody is interested in it. And if we were to have a handle of how the brain does it, we can also reliably enhance it. And everybody would be interested in it. From the military to Google, from the universities, the art schools to the world's medical associations, everybody would be interested in how to reliably enhance this trait. It's a unidirectional trait in the sense that everybody wants more of it. Everybody cherishes it. And we have very little understanding how it works. So let me give you a brief definition of flow and creativity. Very unsatisfying, as you will see, of what it is. So it's a general, vague definition that we agree on. One, we define creativity by ways of the product that it produces, not by the processes in the brain. So a product has to be new. That's obvious. If it is not new, we don't deem it to be creative. Second, a product, whether it's in the arts, whether it's in the sciences, whether it's in engineering, whether it's in business, in all domains of human endeavors, has to be functional. And that includes, with a bit of a wider idea of what we mean by functional or adaptive, the arts. It has to speak to us in some way. That's what we mean by it is functional. And then there's a third criteria that we've adopted that comes from a practical sort of direction of most of the patent offices around the world. The US Patent and Trademark Office, here in the US and the European counterpart as well, define also a patent or give only patents to things that are not only new and functional, but are also surprising. You can look at something, whether it is a piece of art, a piece of science, theoretical or empirical, and see that it is new. You can see it is functional, but yet you would say, that's not surprising. If something is logical, sort of a next logical step, we do not consider something creative. That's a good solution to a problem, but it's not creative. So if you do not have the sense that your expectations are violated, that you are surprised, we usually don't deem something creative. It's also a requirement to get a patent anywhere. In fact, it's explicit in the US Patent and Trademark Office that a solution has to be surprising for you to get a patent in it. We as neuroscientists, we are particularly interested in mechanisms, how things work in the brain. And that brings a problem. Because we do science, we need to control the environment so that we can make cause-effect relationships. Neuroscience has been extremely successful in the last 20 years to figure out what happens in the brain when we do X, Y, and Z. But with creativity, just like with consciousness, or any other complex mental faculty, it is very, very difficult. And one thing that you will appreciate if you are interested in your own creativity is that it comes when it comes, it goes when it goes, and you can't control it. You can't reliably induce it, and that's one of the biggest problems we have, because we need to do it in the lab under controlled conditions to induce it so we can measure what's going on. And obviously you cannot just get somebody in the lab, shove them into the next brain scanner and say, now be creative, starting now, go. But this is exactly what we have to do. And that brings about problem number one, and that is the validity of the research that we have been doing the last 20, 30 years. You'll appreciate this. That we had to use paradigms that simply are not valid. And I've spent about 10 years ago, I spent about a good 3, 4, 5 years dissecting the problem theoretically and conceptually, why the explanations that we currently have do not work well. When we do this, we use a test. We call this in psychology a psychometric measure that measures creativity. The one that we use the most is called the AUT, the Alternative Uses Test. I could do this with you right now, but I think you'll appreciate just generally of how we try to induce creativity. The AUT, the Alternative Uses Test, asks you to come up with alternative uses of a common object. Let's say a brick, or a safety pin, or a tire. And any other idea that you have what you can do with these objects, other than the normal thing that you use it for, is counted. I can throw it at you, I can use it to scratch my back, I can stop a door from closing. Ideas that I have what to do with a brick. And that gets scored while you're on the brain scanner. Laying down there in a weird position with that humming of the functional eye. Not an environment that you would understand, you would appreciate, you're very creative. And we scan the brain. The first problem is, of course, that it has no validity whatsoever, this test. The test does have some validity in the real world. It does predict creative achievements later in life. But in that situation, it doesn't. And so this is our first problem of studying creativity. The second is the concept that we have of creativity. The conceptual basis of this test is something we call divergent thinking. The test asks you to not come up with one right solution, but there's no right solution, but with a bunch of different solutions, and see how creative or how alternative they are. But if you think about it for a split second in your own creativity as well, just a moment's reflection will tell you that you can also be creative with convergent thinking, the exact opposite. So using divergent thinking as a proxy for creativity doesn't work. It is conceptually confounded. So the entire creativity research that we've been doing uses a test that's not valid and a theoretical conceptual basis that makes no sense. We, in science, like to do a control condition and an experimental condition. And the thing you're hunting, in the experimental condition cannot be in the control condition, otherwise you're confounded in the way you do science. But this is exactly what my colleagues are doing. So when you lay this all out, that you don't have a test that's valid and that is conceptually incoherent, then I'm sorry to say that particular paradigm has produced a bunch of explanations that are not explanations. I will tell you what they are, and you probably heard of them, but they are so confounded that we theoretically know next to nothing of what happens. I guess you didn't want to hear that. Yeah, but I'm sad to report, from a neuroscientific point of view, we know very, very little of what is going on. If we knew, that would be very important, because we could reliably enhance it and everybody would be interested. But the fact that there are only a few laboratories in the world to do this kind of research, there's no big money going into that field, shows you that we are pretty much in the dark of how to proceed on how to get good explanation of what happens in the brain when you create. So let me tell you some of these explanations. I'm sure you've heard of them. The first one actually came before brain scanning developed. It is the idea that creativity is in the right brain. I'm sure you've heard of it, the right brain theory. Yeah? That is an idea that, in my opinion, ought to be treated like nuclear waste and buried for a million years. It is phrenology straight up, which is a pseudoscience that associates complex psychological functions with a particular brain area. Complex psychological functions are not done in one particular brain area. There's no brain area where you have your belief in Santa Claus, or your conception of democracy, or what democracy is, or your belief in Jesus or Muhammad. There's no brain area that I can go and take out and you become a Buddhist. The brain doesn't work that compartmentalized, and the same is true for creativity. So the idea that creativity is anywhere is already problematic scientifically. So the right brain theory came about, it's a funny story, it came about from split brain research. These are people who have epilepsy, and in order to treat their epilepsy, their corpus callosum, which is a bundle of fibers connecting the right and the left hemisphere, is cut. And that sort of research that followed from this does show that the left hemisphere does different things than the right hemisphere. Creativity is just not one of those. But it came about because the left does have a tendency to be better at tasks that are analytical and sequential. And we think of this as monotonous problem solving. The right hemisphere is better at synthesis and putting big pictures together. And we associated that with creativity, and that's where the origin of that myth is. Forget it. Your creativity is not in your right brain. And in the field, this is acknowledged, and I think this is also a good example of how important it is for us as neuroscientists to demolish ideas gone bad. And that is one of them. But we neuroscientists, we have contributed to this mess by coming up with better, more advanced explanations that are also this type of pseudoscience. The next front runner in this locating creativity in the brain is the frontal cortex, which we now also know is not the case, because you can be creative with deactivating the frontal cortex. Currently, the front runner is a network in the brain we call the default mode network. It's actually a network with a bunch of brain areas involved. But it's also a false category, because we know that there are types of creativity where you don't use them. What this has gotten us is on a wild goose chase of locating creativity in the brain, which ends up giving us no good explanations at all. I'm sitting here and telling you, from a theoretical, conceptual point of view, we have no clear idea of what happens in a brain when somebody is creative as opposed to when somebody is not creative. So where do we go from here? Because this, of course, is not a good place to end this. The last 10 years, I have spent a good deal of time of thinking of where can we go from here. And since I'm theoretically inclined, I have looked at what do we know in terms of mental faculties, the neuroscience of the basic underlying mechanisms of our cognitive functions, and how we can relate this to creativity. And there are three things that I think, at least for our purposes, I want you to consider as we go forward in understanding what happens in the brain. One is that we give up on hunting locations. It is very likely that creativity in the brain is everywhere. Meaning, if you think of how an entrepreneur is creative, how a dancer is creative, how an engineer is creative, that there's no one brain area that is sort of adds the creative bit to your normal thinking. As if there is sort of a normal thinking, and then there is a network that adds the creative salt into the ocean. That is probably not a good way of thinking about creativity. The way I often compare this to is that you can use a satellite to find England, the country England. It's not a country, maybe soon it will be a country, but you can find the satellite to find England. You can't use a satellite, or a function MRI in this case, to find all the people in the world who speak English, because they are distributed, they are embedded into different networks. They are everywhere on this planet. And that is probably the case with creativity. The creativity that you will find in a scientist as opposed to an artist, we're looking at different mechanisms, we're looking at different brain areas, mechanisms in terms of physiology, in terms of anatomy, in terms of neurochemistry, that there's no one thing. Another way of putting it is that we might have an understanding of creativity as a single trait, like Steve Jobs had it and my grandfather didn't. Notice the singular, yeah? It's one thing, yeah? But in the brain probably it isn't. It doesn't have a single neurosignature. It has many different kinds of neurosignature depending on what kind of creativity and what kind of domain. So talking about what we can associate with creativity, probably nothing. Because for one type of creativity that might be valid, for another type it might not be. And if we continue in neuroscience, and we're guilty of this, to feed the public with simplistic ideas like the right brain or the default mode network, we'll never get anywhere on a very complex problem like creativity. The second thing that I want you to take away from this is the understanding of types of creativity. And by that I don't mean domains, like in the arts, in engineering, in the sciences. There are different ways, modes in which the brain can be creative. And if we do not delineate these types, we have no hope to find mechanisms, because we have to cut the beast into more bite-sized chunks in order to investigate them. The whole thing of creativity doesn't have a neural signature, but a particular type of creativity might. You, for instance, can be creative without trying. You can be creative with trying a lot, trying to figure out and solve a problem. At other times you're creative just cooking or taking a shower and boom, you have an idea. You are in completely different brain states, but both can lead to creativity. Okay? We have to define these types, and I've made a proposal of 3 different types over the last few years, to define these by what we know about the brain. Not define them by domain, but define them by neural mechanisms. There are essentially 3 different types, and flow is one of them. Flow is one type of creativity, one particular state you can get into that is very different, and you can be creative in this state of flow. You can also be creative without being in the state of flow, and that's a different type of creativity. We need these types in order to understand better what we're hunting. In one type, you use more attention. In another type, you lose less attention. And it's good to know this, otherwise that would be confounded. The last thing to allude you to is a more theoretical perspective of what you do computationally when you are creative. Okay, so when you try to solve a problem, you can think of yourself as being in an unknown problem space. That means you're in the middle of a problem space and you don't know where the solution is located. Obviously, if you knew where the solution is located, you wouldn't need to think. Okay? You don't know where the solution is. So you have to make a step. How do you know that this is the right step? You don't. So you have to take multiple steps. And you have what we would call a variation process. You have different variations on your ideas of what to do. Some of these steps you will keep, some of those you don't, in your way towards a solution. So you have a selection process. A third thing is that as you take the next step, you take it from the previous step. So you have an inheritance process. What does it remind you of? A process where you have variation, selection, and inheritance. This is an evolutionary algorithm. You can think mathematically, abstractly. What you're doing when you think creatively, you can model this computationally as an evolutionary algorithm. Okay? That is essentially what your brain is doing. If you know where you're going, you don't need an evolutionary algorithm. But if you are creative, when you develop something, that can be modeled in an evolutionary algorithm. Of course, the biosphere runs an evolutionary algorithm, the Darwinian algorithm, and it's also creative. Your body is a very creative solution to a lot of environmental problems over the last eons and millions of years. Very creative. I wouldn't have come up with it. Yeah? But the evolutionary algorithm did. Yeah? When you think about a problem, you do the same thing. You evolve into or towards the solution. We need to understand this when we hunt for mechanisms, because ultimately that is a mechanism we can be sure of that the brain employs, an evolutionary algorithm. And that's the last point because it relates to artificial intelligence. When we run these algorithms in machines, your brain is a machine. But if we run it in a machine that runs on silicon or germanium rather than carbon, which is the case in your head, yeah, when you run these evolutionary algorithms, understanding them means also that we can possibly implement them. People always get the creeps when they think of machines and robots being created, but it'll come. And what we need in order for this to happen, whether you like it or not, whether you feel comfortable with it or not, is that we need to know the mechanisms. What kind of algorithms we're running. Certainly the algorithms we're running in our head are different than the one that runs in the biosphere. But the better we understand these algorithms or the mechanisms, the more we have a chance to reliably enhance it for our benefit. And I think I stop here at this point.
Dr. Bach, thank you sorry, Dr. Dietrich, thank you so much. And I imagine there are a few questions bubbling. I think what I'd like to do is we will now go to Dr. Bach, have you enhance some of these comments with the work that you're doing, and then we will open it up to questions. Does that sound good? And when we open it up, we'll start with Beirut and Robert Myers, who's over there with some of his cohorts. So now we have Dr. Bach. Thank you so much.
Well, the good news is I think Arne has set me up well so that I can sound a little bit more optimistic. So my intention is to have you walk out of here with not only a little bit of insight into the neuroscience research we're doing, but some practical tools you can walk away with to really have an impact on your creativity and your ability to access both. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine named Lamar took a martial arts class, and one of the things he learned in that class, this is in New York City, is a technique that you can use to disarm somebody who's holding a handgun, which is an issue, clearly in Beirut, but it's an issue in certain parts of New York as well. And the technique he learned is a very simple one. What you do is you take the assailant's wrist and you bend it backward. And if you do that, they can't hold the gun anymore and you can take it away. So in the class, he partnered up with somebody and he practiced this movement. And so he went to his friend and he took the wrist and he bent it back, and then he took away a little plastic gun, and then he handed it back, and then he did it again and again and again. So over the course of around 20 minutes, he practiced this movement around 200 times. Now, a couple days later, late in the evening in the streets of New York, this is a true story, my friend Lamar gets held up at gunpoint. And so I want to ask you, what do you think happened to him in that moment when the gun was pointed at him? Just, shouted out from there.
froze.
He ran.
He
He
ran.
froze, he ran. Well, no, actually, that's not true. It's a two-part answer. The first part is what you would hope with the story, and I'm not going to tell you the story if he froze. The first thing that happened is he actually went to the cell and he bent the wrist back and he took the gun away. It's the second step, which is really where the surprise is. Any guesses? That's exactly correct. So as soon as he took the gun away, he immediately handed the gun back. He actually got himself shot in the foot. It's a true story. Now, this is a discussion on neuroscience. So the reason I'm sharing this story is it's actually a very vivid illustration of one of the most important discoveries we've made in neuroscience in the past 20 years. And that is the brain has the ability to rewire itself. It's what's called neuroplasticity. And so what we know from this story and just from a lot of research is that as you practice a new movement or you practice a new skill, the neurons in your brain will actually rewire themselves, hardwire that skill into your brain. What we are interested in, Arne and I collectively, and particularly the research that we do, is understanding what could we do to help ourselves hardwire our brain, to rewire our brain, so we have more consistent access to things like creativity and to flow. During the past decade, our understanding of what was happening in Lamar's brain, the nature of this neuroplastic process, has really expanded. And the primary breakthrough has been that imaging technology, including the ability to look at EEG waves, including the ability to take pictures of the brain, has just expanded. And with that, our understanding of this neuroplasticity process and how to influence has similarly expanded. What I'd like to do in the time that I have with you is I'd like to cover two topics. I'd like to talk a bit about the research that we are doing, not from a theoretical perspective, but from an experimental perspective, to try to understand, well, what actually is creativity, what is flow, how can you induce it? And then I'd like to turn our attention to something practical. And I'd like to leave you with a couple tips you can walk away with to help you get into a creative state, help you get into a flow state a little bit more often, okay? So, I had dinner with Arne last night, and I was telling him about a research experiment that we recently did, and I want to share it with you because it actually speaks to what Arne was talking about. He was saying it's really hard to measure creativity in a lab because you put someone into a lab setting and said, be creative. So we did a study last year that I'll share with you because I think it's a model for how we do the research, where we took hedge fund traders in New York and we scanned their brains while they were working. So this wasn't in a laboratory setting. These are the kind of people you see on the show Billions. They sit in front of 8 computer monitors and they've got like $100 million they're trading, and they'll buy an oil future and they'll sell cotton or whatever. So they're making all these financial decisions, and so while they're doing that, we've got a headset on and we're looking at their brain waves in continuous fashion for a period of 10 weeks, okay? So at the end of that, what we have is we've got a database with a whole lot of electricity from the brain, and we have a bunch of financial trades, and for every one of them we're like, we know you made money on this, you lost money on this. Then we ran it through a computer, and here's what we discovered. We discovered that during the course of the 10 weeks, these traders went in and out of 2 brain states. And when I say a brain state, that's just something the computer decided. The computer said, here's one brain state, here's another one. In one of those brain states, they made money, and then the other one, they lost money. Very consistent. Every one of the traders, it was the same phenomenon. Now, to me, that's interesting. And we were talking about it, and what actually happened is in the state where they're making the money, you saw that there were 6 regions of the brain that were talking to each other. They were connected, and then the place where they were losing money, those states of the brain were disconnected. The other thing is there was a lot more stress in their nervous system when they were losing money than they were making money. And I'll come back to that when we talk about the practical implications. And so as we in our laboratories are looking at trying to understand creativity, that's the approach we're taking. We're looking to see if we can take people in the wild, jazz musicians or artists or theater people, who are entering a creative state where we say, okay, you're here now, and you're not here at this point, and then we got a lot of data, and then you just run regression analysis with computers, and you start to be able to form a picture of what's happening in the brain. But the point I'm making is it's a totally different approach than Arne uses. Arne goes at it theoretically. What do I think is happening? We are just saying, well, we don't care. The computer will tell us what we see, and then we'll go to people like Arne to try to figure out what that means. But we believe that we will, in fact, within the next 5 years, decode the flow state. Because you can find people in the world who are there, and if you get enough data, you'll start to be able to decode it. Okay, everybody with me so far? So that's the science piece. What does that mean for you? Well, as Arne said, we don't have this yet for creativity. We don't have this yet for flow. And so I'm not going to be able to here leave you with something to be able to induce a state of creativity or flow. Now, there are other things we can induce. What I want to share with you, if you want a practical tool, is that you want to start thinking about the amount of stress you have in your nervous system as a trigger. Because here's what we know. We may not know what creativity looks like in the brain. We may not know what flow looks like in the brain. But what we absolutely know is that there's an inverse correlation between the amount of stress you have in your nervous system and how effective you are cognitively, how creative you are. And remember, I told you this about the traders, and you see this in professional athletes as well. When you are at your best, you need to have a state of extraordinary calm even as you are focused. And if you are stressed, you are unable to access creativity, you are unable to access flow. In fact, you're unable to access high levels of cognitive function. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So why would that be? Well, let's start and talk about what stress is. Stress, you've all heard about it. It's called the fight or flight reaction. It's a very well characterized phenomenon biologically. Now, originally, this didn't come from being attacked by a gun. This came from tens of thousands of years ago when we were in the woods and we would be attacked by, say, a bear. Now, in that moment when the bear is attacking you, your body has a well-programmed reaction which positions you to be able to attack the bear or to be able to run. And the way it does it is when a trigger occurs. You see something which is scary, the amygdala in your brain starts firing off, and then there's this whole cascade of biochemical reactions, including the release from your adrenal glands of neurochemicals, including adrenaline and cortisol. Right? You've all heard of this. And so this is the fight or flight response. What happens with the release of these chemicals is you start taking blood flow and you shunt it from your brain into your musculature. And this makes evolutionary sense, right? If a bear is attacking you in the woods, you don't need to access deep philosophical thinking. You need to say, oh, I think maybe the bear has a family too, right? What you need to be able to do is kill it or run. Everybody with me? So when you are experiencing stress, when you're experiencing the fight or flight reaction, what's happening is the blood flow is going to your musculature. Where is it going away from? It's going away from the brain. And in fact, the part of your brain that is getting the least amount of blood in this point is this frontal part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. Now, as Arne said, that's not always associated with creativity, but it is absolutely associated with cognitive performance. And so, in fact, under extreme states of stress, your IQ will drop by 30 points. You can go from high-level functioning to the IQ of an intelligent gorilla, simply by having the blood flow move away from your prefrontal cortex. And so what we know is, in this state where you've got the adrenaline pumping and where you've got less blood flow in your frontal cortex, you are very unlikely to be able to nail it on an exam or to be able to access something creative. So what's the practical implication of that? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you want to train your brain, because remember, it's a plastic organ, you can train it, to access creativity, to access flow on a consistent basis, the easiest thing you can do is to start to build a training regimen to rewire your brain so the level of stress in your nervous system declines. Does that make sense? If you teach yourself to be relaxed and calm under pressure, that will increase your ability to not only function well cognitively, but in fact will give you more access to creativity and flow, because they're inversely correlated. Everyone following me so far? And unlike creativity, we know how to train stress management. That's a pretty well-established thing. So what do you do to do this? Well, let's start with the basics. What you know for sure is if you exercise, if you sleep on a regular basis, if you meditate on a regular basis, those three things are all well proven to be associated with reductions in stress. Regular daily exercise, getting enough sleep, meditation. And meditation is in fact just a rewiring exercise where you're practicing getting into a state over and over, just like Lamar did, of being relaxed. And so if you want to be creative, learning mindfulness, learning meditation, exercising regularly will do it for you. But with that said, I want to give you a technique that you can walk out with today, which could have an enormous and immediate impact on stress. So let me tell you another story. About 15 months ago, I was actually doing something like, this kind of, discussion. And it was some high-powered business people. And there was a woman in the audience named Mary who came in with a very interesting problem. Mary was the CEO of a very well-run, very well-respected company. Her problem was that she co-ran the company with a man that she had just divorced. And so he ran the financial functions and she ran the other functions. And so she said, about 5 or 6 times a day, her husband would just come screaming into her office and start yelling at her, typically about money. What's happening to our cash flow? And what's happening, we're running out of money and so on. And what happened is after 20 years of marriage, every time he started yelling at her, her body froze. She went into a fight or flight reaction. And then for the next hour and a half, she was shaking. She just couldn't function. So if you do the math, it just completely messed up her life and she didn't know what to do. And she had been to a psychologist and she'd been to a psychiatrist. She didn't know what to do. And so what I did is I set her up on a program, right then and there, which was developed at the Mass General Hospital about 10 years ago called the Measure, Interrupt, and Replace technique. And here's what we did. We had her create an association between her husband and a state of relaxation. And what we did specifically is we taught her something called laughing yoga. In laughing yoga, what you do is you laugh for no reason for about 3 or 4 minutes nonstop. And so specifically, what we asked her to do is every morning when she got up, she was sitting at the dining table, she was drinking her morning cup of coffee, she was supposed to imagine her husband coming in and screaming at her. And as she did that, and as her body started to tense, at that point she had to laugh nonstop for 3 minutes while thinking about her husband yelling at her. 31 days later, after the program was done, she wrote me an email. She said, David, it's the strangest thing, but every single time my ex-husband comes into my office, I have this uncontrollable urge to laugh. Now, what happened in her brain? How come this occurred? It's just the Lamar story again. What happened is because of neuroplasticity, Mary built a new neural pathway where the stimulus of her husband screaming at her was associated with laughter. And by the way, laughing yoga is great for relaxation. It gets you a lot of blood flow. You can't laugh and simultaneously be tense. And in fact, she said because of that, her productivity improved and even the relationship with her ex had improved. And so again, if you want a practical technique, doing exactly that with any stressor, thinking about an exam coming up, for those of you who maybe were thinking about a theater performance you're about to do, creating that association right before will rewire your brain and completely change your reaction. So the 3 takeaway messages I'd like to leave you with before we close and open this up for questions are these. First, I would ask you to remember that your brain is a deeply plastic organ, that it can be rewired. And so whatever you think may be the case, that you have a bad memory or you're not good at paying attention or you're chronically stressed, is something that can be retrained. Second of all, that if you want to retrain yourself and get yourself into a state of flow and creativity more often, we may not know how to train those things, but we do know that if you teach yourself to have less stress in your nervous system, it will help. And remember, I said you can do that through exercise, you can do that through sleep, You can do that through meditation. And then finally, we talked about this technique, this measure, interrupt, replace technique, where you can create associations in your mind between triggers that induce stress and relaxation responses. And that will actually induce very rapid changes. And so with that, I will close and open it up for questions. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bach. And I wonder if just before, Robert, we go to you in Beirut, if Dr. Dietrich, you have anything you would like to say in response to that?
I think it's better that we have some questions and see where they're going. David and I will often have these sort of discussions, and they're very fruitful, particularly in the mechanism of why stress does this. What is the mechanism in the brain? And about 12 years ago, I have proposed a hypothesis, a theory of how that works. And he's described it. I've called it transient hyperfrontality. When in the frontal cortex you have reduced activity, you are less analytical about the bear's family, yeah, and therefore survive. That has an evolutionary function, and that to me is where we intersect. That you do know how things work, but not why they work. And together, understanding how to tackle this, but also understanding the underlying mechanism will hopefully get us to more specific ways on how to do this. I wish you would have talked a little bit of how to train brain states, of how to do the neurofeedback.
Yeah.
But I guess you can do this.
I'm happy to do that.
Can we get to that?
Yeah.
That would be wonderful.
I'm happy to. Yeah, but the problem is it involves some technology. But I was going to talk about a different science experiment where we trained brain states using neurofeedback, and if you want, happy to go into that. But this is your agenda, so
I think I'm going to put that on the table,
Okay.
and if we have time, I'm going to hand it over to you, if that's good. Robert, would you like to say good afternoon to us and have a response from that end?
Well, thanks so much. It's great to see you, and it's great to be here. Thanks to everybody who showed up here on our end. Arne and I've had many conversations over the years, and every time we do, I come away with something, and I think adding this idea of relaxation, I just loved hearing it, and it made me think about the behavior of pilots in very stressful situations. That, actually listening to black boxes of pilots, you see what we know that they don't know, and this is what we in theater call dramatic irony, is we know the plane's going down this time, but they don't. And therefore, we get to see them behave in the 2 minutes or 3 minutes before, and many other times it turns out just fine. And it is precisely the fact that they are able to go through a very rapid process and creative process of choice. Try this. Okay, look at the manual. Do this, do that, do whatever. And then you come out of the decline or whatever, and the plane keeps going, and we're back there, having our dinner. We don't know. But in fact, the combination of a kind of Darwinian algorithmic approach with low stress is the recipe for creativity, I think. And the other thing that I'd love to hear people talk about, and this is a very generational thing that I see, is that creativity, in my humble experience, is related to being able to focus very intently on one thing. And that's why I think I talked about the pilots going through one thing and then another thing and another thing and another thing, right? Is the idea that, creativity comes from doing many things at once, having experienced it myself and seeing a lot of people engaged in simultaneity. I'm intrigued with that aspect of it, which is to say, Do you think in this moment of multitasking that there is such a thing as sort of multitasking creativity, or is it this intense process, whether you want to call it flow or whatever else it is, of very rapidly going through a series of processes that you're barely conscious of or whatever, and then you come upon, one or whatever. To me, that comes as close to a definition of my own subjective experience of creativity, though others may have this idea that creativity is, you're feeling like you're doing a bunch of things at once and you succeed at it. But comments here? Oh, great.
Yeah. Hi. So my name is Dujain. I'm a psychology student, and I'm actually a student of Dr. Arne. Hi, Dr. Arne. We miss you.
Hi.
Okay, so my question is to Dr. Arne is that when it comes to creativity, I think creativity is not something that, and please correct my line of thought if I said something wrong, but I don't think creativity is something that it is only in humans. Like animals can be creative too, because there was this experiment where they would put a monkey, for example, and a ladder and put the bananas up, and eventually the monkey would creatively think of how he could reach the food in some way or another, and eventually he would realize that, okay, so I got to put the ladder and go up the ladder to get the bananas. So actually creativity, what I'm thinking of is that since it's even in animals, which means it's not a higher functioning thing, which means maybe it could be restricted into the hindbrain or the midbrain. I'm trying not to be chronological, but that's how I'm thinking about it. So how can we, based from animals, understand how creativity works? And thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. First of all, yes, of course, animals are creative.
Do you want to answer that before we proceed, or shall we have a few other people speak?
Let's answer
Everybody
that.
wants to talk here.
I can
All
address
this
this
talk
quick.
of creativity has gotten everyone excited here in Beirut.
I can address this fairly quickly, I think, and then we don't have to keep this in mind. So of course animals are creative, but there's this big, gigantic jump between them and us of chimpanzees. The experiment you described from Wolfgang Köhler about 100 years ago is very famous. It was done on chimpanzees. And yes, the chimp got the banana, but we do cell phones, a bit more sophisticated. And also, that kind of creativity depends on both more frontal activation and less activation. And here comes the kicker. Depending on the type of creativity. There's no such thing in one thing. It's also true for what Robert just said in terms, and also in terms of stress. We're looking here and presentation on stress, particularly on decision making and flow. That's one particular type. But less stress and creativity is not so easily associated with positive correlation. Hindbrain, yeah, depending on the type of creativity. Midbrain, yeah, depending on the type of creativity, and that's also the case with the frontal cortex. You can be creative in terms of higher cognitive functions, really trying, solving all the problem, using all the memory, all the expertise, all the knowledge you have, yeah, and also being very focused, intensely focused on one thing. It can also come to people who have much less knowledge, don't know much of anything, and it happens to them while they're taking a shower. So both in terms of focused or defocused attention, higher functions, and different brain areas. As I said, I think once we understand types, we have a better grasp of what type is associated with what thing. Because creativity as a whole is probably not associated with anything that simple, more or less stress. Flow might, but not creativity. And flow is one type of creativity. So I think understanding this, we have a better nomenclature to understand all what we're talking about.
David, do you have anything you want to say on this? All right, Robert, let's do another question from Beirut, and then we have one online, and then we'll come to our room here. Thank you.
Hello, this is Iman Karut. I'm a PhD candidate in biomedical sciences. Actually, I just want to give my idea regarding what Dr. Dave, I guess his name, pointed out regarding the correlation between the stress and the creativity. From my own experience, I'm actually a painter, pianist, and certified photographer. So being that, I only experience the attack of thoughts only when I have exams. So during my exam, I have a very severe creative attacks of thought that I cannot even complete my study. One time I quit my study and I went to business. I even exercised during that period, and I couldn't create anything, neither to play piano new notes or, for example, take photography. I quit everything literally. So basically I had to come back to academic life and to continue my studies because I felt that the stimulus has gone when I quit. Exercise couldn't benefit me at all. Only being in academic atmosphere while under the stress of study, I could again produce new paints, new pieces of music and whatever. Also during my before I sleep, I have this attack of thought, but not as aggressive as during exam time. And maybe during while I'm praying or doing something else, maybe I will have that flash of things that come to my brain from nowhere, and eventually I can do new things. So I don't know how my experience can advocate or can help what you have already mentioned. Thank you.
I just want to begin and make sure I understand what you're saying. You talk about an attack of creativity. So let me repeat back what I heard, and then I'm either getting it right or completely wrong. What I think I heard you say is that you are more creative when you are more stressed out. That basically the more intense the anxiety, the more able you are to create music or to create paintings. And so that kind of flies in the face of what I said, sort of suggesting that if you're relaxed, you're just unable to be creative. Is that correct?
That's what she said.
Yeah, that is what you said. So, it's funny, the problem I guess I would, share is, first of all, you never argue with the facts. And so, if you want to kind of say, well, here's a scientist who's all well respected who says I should be relaxed, but when I'm relaxed, I'm not creative. You got to go with what's true for you. What I will say to you is, first of all, you got to figure out what works for you. But the second thing is, nothing about what I'm saying or Arne is saying is as simple as I'm making it sound. And so, the fact is, being calm doesn't create creativity. What does happen for most people, and it sounds like not for you, is, well, actually, let me share this, because I'll go into the sort of theoretical science. In psychology, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. It's a study of where people perform optimally as a function of the amount of arousal in their nervous system. And there's a linkage between arousal and stress. What actually is the case is, it's kind of, like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears story. If you have too little stress or too much stress in your nervous system, too much arousal, you don't function well. You got to kind of find that sweet spot. And so what I will share with you is, for example, we actually just did a study on pilots, looking at their ability to function under high stress conditions, and found that you have to have them at a certain place in the Yerkes-Dodson curve to be able to be optimally productive. And so I was a little bit reductionist. The truth of the matter is, you got to sort of find that sweet spot. And there is absolutely the case that anxiety and pressure can sometimes be the mothers of invention. And so let me modify what I said and say it like this. If you are excessively stressed out, you may have trouble finding creativity or finding flow. But by contrast, if you are bored and unaroused and uninterested, you'll almost definitely not be able to access creativity. So it may be that what you've discovered in yourself is your optimal point on your Dodson curve. That as long as you're under pressure and you've got a lot of stress, that motivates you to be creative. But I will tell you, it is absolutely the case. If you go too far over, if you get to the point where you are too anxious, it's going to kill your creativity. And that's a well-established scientific kind of phenomenon. And so I want to thank you very much for what you've shared. It's it's really useful, and it's always good when you're a scientist to actually have people kind of come back to you with reality, because it keeps us honest. Because it's for Arne and me, it's really easy for us to just like spout things off without having to actually justify it in the real world. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. We're going to go to a question online here.
Yes.
Justin?
Brahim from California asked on Facebook, what were our brains like, what are our brains like today compared to 50, 100, and 300 years ago?
At what level of resolution? Gross anatomy, physiology, same. Evolution doesn't work that quickly. But of course, with the technology and demands we have of the modern world, what David calls rewiring, of course, we have behavioral repertoires that now have well established that we can learn, and we can learn quicker, that are different to those who lived in an environment 50 or 100 years ago. 100 years ago, not a single record on this planet was digitized. Now this is our entire world, and so we attend differently to it, and that means that perceptual system, memory system, attentional systems work differently because from the get-go they're developed in a different direction, to different levels of strengths. So at some level of resolution, we would find differences in terms of how easy it is to activate certain circuitry, and we would find this also in functional MRIs as 100 years ago. But there's no radically different brain. If you take the brain out of somebody 100 years ago, you would not be able to tell which of the two brains is one that died yesterday and one that died 100 years ago.
All right. Can we take some questions from this room, and we'll maybe do this for about 10 minutes and then have some concluding remarks, if that's all right. Can I give you that just so for recording purpose? Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Hello. My name is Eric. I have a business or practice or calling where I work with teenagers. And you're using the word flow a lot today. And I use kind of this image of the kids I work with have been blown off the tracks. So, as your brain is forming, you lose a grandparent or a pet or something, you don't get blown off the tracks, but the kids I work with, they've lost siblings, parents, they've been raped, addiction, you name it, they get blown off the tracks. So their life flow is interrupted. So I go to things like this to try to help these kids. Or I was one of those kids, so also to help myself and help them. So when you were talking about the laughing yoga, for example, so I preach a lot of the things you talk about: sleep, diet. For meditation, I have them do things that they're really confident in, because they get into a meditative state that way. But what I find is, because they've been blown off the tracks during the formation, when they default to the stress. So something like a laughing yoga technique will work with, let's say, a mildly stressful teacher conference. But when their father rips into them or something, when it really comes down, when the bear has got the fangs, that just goes out the window. And so what I'm constantly seeking outside of pharmaceuticals, because I don't believe in it for the most part, is how do I get these kids, when the bear's fangs are out, to not default to what's happened to them. Does that make, to get back into,
That makes total sense.
find new tracks. So that's what I try to do. So I've really enjoyed this talk, so I'm thinking maybe you have some creative solutions. Thank you.
Do you want to address this?
I'll take this. So the first thing I'll say is, the issue you describe is a very real problem. And, it's funny, my girlfriend, Arne's wife, both work with populations very similar to this. And the fact is, the challenge you're describing is the same challenge I'm describing, but it's much harder to deal with in extreme situations. And, the phrase most commonly used to describe this is what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And what that is it's a place where there is a stimulus which is so deeply tied to a stress reaction, the memory of a rape, the memory of someone dying at a young age, that rewiring the brain in that situation becomes almost impossible. And all the techniques that we talk about, laughing yoga or meditation, they seem to kind of not be strong enough to really have an impact. Right? And so the first thing I'll share is, it's very beautiful work, and the best one can hope for is to make small amounts of gradual progress. And here you go into the world of psychology to understand, really what matters, and there's no question consistency and human connection have an impact. What I would direct you to is the work of a guy named Bessel van der Kolk. Van der Kolk. It's Vanderkolk. He's Dutch. And in fact, he's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist who has spent the last 30 years of his life studying how to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And, this is not my work, and I'd encourage you to read it directly, but what I would say is the first thing he's figured out is there's no silver bullet. And so, and you know this already, the more things you do all at once, the better. The second thing is he's come to discover that work on the body is a very useful thing for relieving stress. That there's a theory from the Eastern traditions that trauma is actually stored in parts of the body, right? And that if you do physical practices, things like yoga, you can actually, with that, begin to relieve those traumas.
Take them on walks. Their worst days, you go walking.
Right. So, but I mean, energy medicine and things like that. So all I would say is, what I am describing is accurate and well proven. What I am describing does have an impact, and in situations like those you're dealing with, where the trauma is so extreme, you have to try a lot of things, and all you can hope for is to make small improvements. And there are some really miraculous stories of people who have recovered from very extreme cases of PTSD simply with continuous practice, and their brains will rewire. And in fact, the brain images of people before and after are quite stunning. So that's all I would share. It's again beautiful work, and I wish we had a silver bullet on here's how to access creativity, here's how to cure PTSD. But it's also the case that it's not hopeless, and you can make a difference.
Thank you.
Yeah. Once you're dealing with a clinical pathology, once you're dealing with a baseline of levels of stress and post-traumatic stress that is considerably higher, and you have a baseline much higher, the basic technique that David is describing, we call it systematic desensitization, what David would call rewiring. It is learning a different association between stimulus and reinforcement procedures. And they still work on your population. And in fact, this is still quite successful even with extreme trauma. We're talking prisoners of war, we're talking rape, and there's very, very good data to show this. So in basic principle, it still works, but of course, given the baseline and the amount of trauma or the level of trauma, it will take much more work than stress relieving for somebody who doesn't have a clinical pathology, who's just simply stressed, which is very different.
Right.
But the techniques are the same. There are a couple of very interesting directions in terms of research. We know, for instance, that continuous stress does damage areas of the brain. We have seen evidence of degeneration in the areas such as the hippocampus. There's a very good work to show now that stress is even inherited. in terms
That's been
of
my experience.
the brain.
Yes.
It's not genetically, but it's epigenetic inheritance of continuous stress. So we're discovering more, and this is just recent, the last 5 years, that we see that parents' stress can transmit this to their children.
Absolutely.
And therefore they have different baselines of activity, including their reactions to stimuli is enhanced in the amygdala. So there's more that we learn on the mechanisms of how that works and what we can possibly do with that. So you might want to read more up on this, because there's lots and lots of work on all directions about stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. So it'd be interesting.
Is this something I could maybe offline?
Yeah, sure.
I'd love to find some practitioners, PTSD, maybe who follow this Vander Kolka, something like that.
There's a lot out there.
Yeah, there is.
And they're not going anywhere for a few minutes
Thank
after
you. Thanks for
this.
your time.
So
Yeah.
do we have another question in this room? Can I give that to you, Richard? And oh, another one online.
Not sure if this is for me actually, Justin. I'm not sure.
You're not online.
I'm always online now. I want to ask you, I guess, to zoom out, I guess, if you would, and what you're just talking about degeneration in certain parts of the brain under high levels of stress. There's a lot of stress, especially in poor communities that live in stress all the time. What do you think can be done at a macro level? I don't know if this affects maybe like in the large communities. I'm not sure if it affects creativity as much, but maybe like I guess in frontal lobe cortex, if there's damage there, it would be more on the level of, I guess, cognitive. What was the term? Sorry, just like
Performance.
Cognitive performance. Yes. I guess what would you, maybe this might not be any with us, as I said, like policy-wise, or just how you view the world in general, like at a macro level with regards to stress, intergenerational stress, and what that means for our society.
Oh yeah, that's too deep.
Yeah, I almost never pass on a question, but I think that's a little out of both of our wheelhouse, and it's a little bit deep. And as a question where there's 3 minutes left in the session, it's a bit hard to answer. One thing that I will share is this. The neuroscience community as a whole is deeply aware of the issue that you're raising. The level of chronic stress particularly in Western society, has grown immensely. The growth of technology has done, many good things for the brain, but it's done immense damage to the brain as well. Everything about the iPhone is designed to make it hard to stay focused, for example. And so this idea of multitasking, which we say is bad for the brain, everything about technology is actually pushing us there. And in fact, there's all sorts of other things that the digital revolution is doing, which create stress, which create challenge. It's well known in the social media world that Facebook, Instagram, and the like are causing depression because people are looking at images which are not real and then comparing themselves. And so it is outside the scope of this topic to talk about what can be done. But I would simply say we in the neuroscience community are deeply aware of the issue, and it's a real one that's just kind of coming at us because of what's happening in the world. And it's hard to. I'm the optimist among the two of us, but on this topic, it's a tough time we're living in.
To bring us to a close here, and I will say that after we finish officially, please feel free to stay for a few minutes. I'm sure you're not going to run, either of you. We may have a few more questions here, but could I ask each of you to give a kind of closing statement or two on where you see your research going next, where you see an avenue that's opening up? of real interest in what you're doing, and any summary statements you'd like to make. And maybe, Arne, we could start with you, and we'll end with David, and then close it down.
Neuroscience is a very young discipline, and we are discovering a lot of things that we know already empirically on how to do certain things, but understanding the mechanisms of which. But there are lots of things we don't yet understand. Of how the brain works and how the brain changes cognitive functions, whether it is consciousness or creativity or flow or a whole list of others. I see this discipline basically before, like physics, before we had a Newton, much less an Einstein. In the very beginning of understanding the human condition at a different resolution, at a different level, in terms of the neuroscience and what neuroscience can contribute to our understanding of ourselves. And we're just starting, last 20, 30, 40 years. When I look at my lifetime, another 40, 50 years or so, hopefully, of where we will be, I hope that, and I'm pretty sure there will be great discoveries, great strides forward, but we also have to do this in a way that is sound. And in neuroscience, it has expanded already in a whole bunch of fields it shouldn't have. It is too early, and the explanations being used do not hold water. They are not coherent, they are not sound, whether this is neuromarketing. Neuro is now in everything. As long as you say neuro, you seem to have an explanation of something. And it is very, very dangerous that we're becoming sort of a new pseudoscience, a neuroeducation. And we have to be very careful to make solid progress. And I hope we contribute to this. And then the progress will be great. And we will see lots of changes in the next 10, 20, 40, 50 years of understanding this.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. I think what I want to share as a closing comment is a little bit of perspective from the commercial world about the future of neuroscience. Last year, 2018, there were $350 million invested by Silicon Valley into neuroscience-related companies. Now contrast that with 2017, where there were $50 million and almost nothing the year before. This year is probably going to be close to $1 billion invested in neuroscience-based companies. Now the science is where we're talking about, and some of what's getting invested in, I think, both Arne and I would agree is absolutely pseudoscience, but some of it's real as well. I mean, the thing is, even as we don't understand the brain, there are technologies which are well established that can have an impact on the brain. There are things that can allow you to improve your memory, to make your brain process things more quickly, and the like. Think about, for the moment, the implications of what I told you about the hedge fund. That if you can actually predict a trade being profitable or not, every hedge fund in the world is going to need that technology. Every basketball team is going to need things to make their players' brains, faster and the like. And so I think when we look into the future, the growth of technology is going to start to include the word neuro in it. And you're going to start to see people putting headsets on themselves to monitor what's happening in their brain, and you're going to see the use of it for all sorts of good purposes and all sorts of bad purposes, and some of it's going to work really well and some of it's just going to be total garbage, which is marketed. But the fact of the matter is there is a revolution underway, and I think during the next 15 years, neuroscience is going to start being pervasive in the commercial world the same way that computers and the internet and big data analytics are. And so for those of us who are the optimists here, we think of this as a really exciting time where there's actually going to be capital available to make discoveries, and we're going to actually be able to tap into this science, ideally to upgrade the human condition, to start to investigate how to reduce stress and to improve cognitive function, and ultimately to be able to use technology to help people access creativity and flow on a more consistent basis. Because the ultimate goal here is not only to understand the brain, but to use that information to elevate the human experience.
May I say that we all are able to read your most recent book, How Creativity Happens in the Brain, and we can follow the Platypus Neuro Institute. Is that right?
Yeah, we don't, it's not easy to follow. So we do have that podcast though that you like,
Yes.
right? So,
David has a podcast called Neuro
Neuron Fire. Yeah.
Neuron Fire.
I actually interviewed Arne.
So that is one thing everyone in the room can do, is we can keep our eye on your work in the future and send you notes and ask if it's pseudoscience or if it's real. We'll ask you that, Arne. And I really thank you both for giving us your time and the generosity of your thought. It's a wonderful thing, and I think we could have a round of applause and close out.
Thank you.